Okay, Xuetong, you just made a very important point that the cultural or strategic thinking is extremely important in shaping foreign policies. Can you summarize for us what are the major differences between the Chinese strategic thinking and the US or Western one?
Well, if you try to identify the differences between the Chinese culture and the European oriented culture, and you can find it in many fields. But then I want to just pick the one of the key point. And traditionally, Chinese culture believe in the hierarchical system. And so you know that they're always talking about a so-called tribunal system. And China at the center in the ancient time, and the periphery countries to contribute gifts to China, and that's what Westerners believed. Actually, this system is invented in the very, very ancient time. But then they concern only you have a hierarchical system, you can maintain the stability and the peace. If you look at the history, and you find that, even today, not history, today, if you want to maintain the order in the UN, what do you need? You need echelons. You have the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. You have the non-permanent members of the Security Council and ordinary countries. In World Bank and the IMF, certainly you have the echelon according to their share and the capital in the country. So Chinese culture firmly believe without the echelon, you can't maintain the order.
So by implication, would you say that China will actually try to become a center of the world, try to kind of emulate today's U.S. dominance in international organizations, in the World Bank, at the UN?
And today, from my understanding, I don't think any Chinese believe it's possible to make China become the only superpower in the world in this century. Recently, some economists, I think American economists, suppose that, and 2015 and will be the first year of the China's century. And I just published an article, possibly tomorrow, or you can see that on the Global Times. I think that won't be possible. And in China, I think every policy understands that, and we believe that no one can dominate the world. And Americans are lucky, become the dominating power after the Cold War. But then that's just by chance, and cannot be lasted for over 100 years. And China, personally, I don't think China can achieve that position in this century.
Okay, dominance may be too strong a word, but would you say that China will try to become a center, not the center of the world affairs?
Well, if anyone has that kind of concern, I think he is doomed to be failed. It's impossible. Globalization makes the world more diversified rather than unified. And if you look at the world, and we have more and more countries and states rather less. 1945, we have only 51 states in the UN. Now we have 193. And very soon, we are going to have more than 200 members of the UN, and that number continues to grow. I doubt the number will decline. And even the last year, we almost possibly to see a new state of Scotland. Scotland.
So what's the implication for Chinese traditional thinking of hierarchy on the China's foreign policy?
This hierarchical tradition, and make China already suggest that, and all of the countries should have the common responsibility, but different. It's called common but different responsibilities. For instance, like this reduction of the CO2 and cleaning the pollution. And then China, the big country should undertake more responsibility than the weaker countries.
Mm-hmm. So would you say China will gradually take on more responsibilities and therefore, by implication, slightly more powers?
First, I think China will be inevitably undertake more responsibility. No matter policymakers like it or not, they will be forced to do that. And second, I think Xi Jinping already changed this policy. Just now we're talking about his reform. He's the first Chinese president and promised that China will provide public goods for international community. And before him, no any foreign policy promised that. And because they know that if you promise to provide public goods, a lot of people will oppose you. They think you use Chinese money to serve foreigners' interests.
Okay, talk about China in this neighborhood. Would you say that China will become more active in dealing with neighbors and therefore demanding more respect from neighbors?
Well, I think the suggestion or the policy of the One Belt and One Route is already illustrated China's initiative and activity towards surrounding countries. And also, if you read the report by Li Keqiang very recently, and he said that China is considered to establish the destiny community with surrounding countries.
Would you agree with or disagree with Lee Kuan Yew in arguing that China will try to go back to history, the practice of history, of trying to obtain respect from neighbors, like in the tribute system?
Lee Kuan Yew is not the only person argue that China will resume the tribute system. Actually, I think that's just a kind of a misunderstanding. And I can suggest you to read one article by a professor at the Oxford University, and Professor Kuhn. And he said that if you examine American-dominated post-Cold War international system, quite similar, like the Chinese-dominated ancient tribute system. So that's just a name, tribute system. And if you look at the content, not fundamentally different from what American did today. For instance, just now we talked about a case. American talk to these countries, hey, you should not join the AIIB, right? They try to want others to follow his idea.
You are from inside China. You're an expert in China, locally situated in China. In what aspect do you disagree with Dr. Kissinger in arguing that history or culture will shape the future of Chinese policy?
Well, generally speaking, I highly appreciate Kissinger. I learned a lot from him. I do not agree with him very much. But one thing is that, and I will regard it that China will modernize our traditional culture rather than just copy the ancient idea or apply it directly to our current foreign policy.
Specifically, let's pick one example.
For instance, and if you're concerned with China's ancient policy, we always have two strategies. One is a so-called fight against the neighbor and getting alliance with the father countries. The second one is create a good neighborhood. From my understanding, and the globalization will make China won't hesitate to make a decision between these two kinds of strategy. China will be formally abandoned the strategy attacking the neighbor and by allying with the country afar. And China will definitely focus on only the good neighborhood. The reason is that the globalization make the former strategy won't work.
Very good example. Okay, now switching a topic, you just mentioned that reform can be dangerous. Now we understand danger of reform in the context of domestic economy, right? We know the interest groups. Now talk about foreign policy. What are the dangers in China's reform of foreign policy? Can you give us some examples?
I think currently you heard there's one saying by our central government. The concern that internal situation and the external situation merged into one. That means the domestic interest groups have a strong impact on our foreign policy. And for instance, this oil company, they are so powerful, and so they have a strong impact on foreign policy making. And the pipelines and the maritime oil rigs and many things, and they have influence on it.
But isn't that the case that these Chinese companies are operating overseas, so they are pushing for a more active Chinese foreign policy? They are pushing for the reform. They're benefiting from the reform rather than losing interest from the reform.
Well, I do not say that all of our national interest, national state enterprises and ignore national interests. But the first interest get the priority from their policy is their own interests rather than national interests.
What are the examples of the danger of reforming foreign policy?
Well, already happened. And we transferred from the keeping low profile strategy to striving for achievement strategy. And if we make any mistake or any troubles, and then we'll be being criticized, say, no, you see, all of these problems because you abandoned the keeping low profile strategy. It's already happened.
Any dangers of this reform from outside China?
Well, I didn't get the question. What do you mean?
In other words, this reform of Chinese policy may cause problems from outside China. Foreign forces will go against this change of policy.
Well, by now, I think this China's foreign policy at this moment and create more benefits for the world rather than less. And still, we take the AIIB as the case, and then you find that China started to establish more and more financial institutions and lend money to others. This is very different from before. Usually, we only borrow money from others, or we purchase others' bonds, but we do not lend money to others. Now we prepare to lend money to others. And certainly, you said that do this policy will hurt others' interests? Inevitably. Because when China established these financial institutions, and it will make some financial institutions and not that influential. So unfortunately, the relationship or the power relationship is zero-sum game. It's inevitable. That's why the U.S. is unhappy to see China to initiate the AIIB.
It seems that more and more traditional alliances of the U.S. are moving towards China, at least in economic issues, like the internationalization of RMB, like the AIIB, right? Will there be a case or situation where the U.S. becomes so angry that a crisis will happen, putting pressure on China?
Well, I think alliance for the IR scholars always defined as a military relationship. It had nothing to do with economic relations. So no matter how close the Americans' military alliance and to China in terms of economy, I don't think it changed the international configuration fundamentally. And you see, and China and Japan have a very close economic relationship, but then our strategic relationship get to the bottom. And our economic relationship with Russia, not that dramatic, but then we have a very good strategic relationship. So for me, and these American military allies get closer to China in terms of economy do not mean very much.
Will there be a change in the military landscape with the reform of Chinese foreign policy? In other words, China becoming militarily more active and assertive?
Well, I think China will definitely become militarily assertive. And the reason is that, and when China becomes stronger and stronger, and when China's international status is increased, and then there's a more international requirement for China to undertake international responsibility. There's a misunderstanding. Many people believe international responsibility means providing more economic aid. My understanding, that's wrong. International responsibility, the first definition for international responsibility means provide a security protection. And so if China do not provide security protection for other countries, and China will never be regarded as a responsible power. That's why when we found the chemical weapons in Syria, and China sent the warship there to help to solve the problem. And China can say, no, that's far from me and has nothing to do with me. I want to do business. I can lend you money, but I don't know help about the chemical weapons. You can't. And then you find that no country will ask Vietnam to solve this problem. And Vietnam can say that, hey, that's not my problem. So as long as China becomes stronger and stronger, China has no other choice, must take more responsibility in terms of military.
Can you play a Hollywood movie, the most intense or most interesting conflict between China and the U.S. in the coming decades? Hypothetically, play a movie for us.
Well, I think that movie will have a good market.
Can you improvise on the spot a movie for us, a conflict between China and the U.S.? Where, one, in what fashion, involving what kind of army, as concrete as possible?
Yeah. I think the rivalry between China and the U.S., even we use the term rivalry instead of a competition, I think it will mainly focus on in the technology fields and in the finance and also in this military capability. I mean, the military capability mainly refers to military technology. And so in the future, you will see China and the U.S. will compete for these things. And before that, I think China will compete with the U.S. for the market because China already becomes the largest world trader.
Would you see the conflict between the U.S. and China would be most likely in the traditional military fashion of cyber war, intelligence, cyber war?
First, the cyber war is something new. The cyber war never experienced in human history. It's the first time. So I don't think we can apply any traditional strategy for it. And we don't know what it is. So nowadays, China and the U.S. Is working together. We already have the joint working group, try to figure out what kind of international norm we can set up to govern or manage the cyber conflicts. I don't know what it will be, but one thing is clear. China and the U.S. already concerned how to avoid the conflicts on the cyber fields escalating into military confrontation.
Wonderful. Very good discussion. Thank you very much.